The over-the-counter derivatives market is somewhere in the hundreds of trillions of dollars in terms of how much is out there. And estimates put that anywhere between 600 to even 700 trillion dollars. Now, when you examine any financial institution's balance sheet, you are never going to find any number that approaches any amount that, when you add them together, could equal this massive hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of derivatives. So in this video, we're going to dive into where these derivatives actually hide on bank balance sheets, how they hide in plain sight, and massive risk that puts into the financial system. And there is one bank in particular that has exposure to up to $40 trillion worth of over-the-counter derivatives. Let's dive in. In this episode, the first thing that we're going to do is look at arbitrage, and I'm going to do a quick explanation of what arbitrage is because it helps explain how these derivatives are hiding on balance sheets. Number two, the second thing that we're going to look at is what derivatives are, because that helps explain why this puts so much risk into the financial system. And then the third thing that we're going to do is tie it all together and look at a bank who is a giant culprit in this mess right now. And if you haven't already guessed it, that bank is Deutsche Bank. So number one, arbitrage. If you haven't viewed this video already, I will link it in the description below, but I've done a pretty extensive video explaining what arbitrage is and how it works. In essence though, arbitrage is simply buying and selling the same thing and pocketing the difference. And so it's what garage sellers do when you go garage selling and you find something at a garage sale and you buy it and then you go and sell it on eBay later for a larger price. But usually when you're doing arbitrage, you're doing them at the same time normally, especially banks with financial instruments. You're not doing one after another. You're holding the same positions open. And so it might be similar to, maybe then you can think of like a drop shipper online who hosts a drop shipping website. You might make a sale of something, so you've sold something that you don't actually own yet, you get the money for it, and then you go buy something from a warehouse and have them ship it directly to your customer. And so at the same time you're holding a sale of something and a purchase of something. The purchase, as long as you're not a horrible drop shipper, the purchase price for you is going to be less than the sale price for your customer. You'll pocket the difference. You're holding an open buy position and an open sell position on the same item. One more small example, let's take a look at stocks. Now in practice, nobody really does this because you really can't, but it helps really cement in the idea of what arbitraging is if you're not familiar with it. Take a company that has two different classes of shares, let's say Google or Under Armour. An arbitrage play would be to buy one class of shares and then short the other class of shares. Now, let's say in the case of Google, you buy the one that holds the voting rights and you short the one that doesn't. And over time, they're the same company, so they're going to have almost identical performance changes. But there might be slight differences here and there as institutions step in and buy the voting rights shares instead of the non-voting rights shares. And so over time, you might have a little bit of a difference that you can capitalize on when the shares separate in their performance, and you can move money back and forth as that price difference separates. And you're never going to really have the opposite happen where the non-voting shares outperform the voting shares. As the two share classes converge and diverge, you can move your position around to take advantage of that fact, knowing that they'll never really go opposite of each other. Now, I use this example just because it helps cement the idea of arbitrage. In practice, you're not really doing that with stock shares, but financial institutions are doing this with derivatives. So what is a derivative? A derivative is an option or a futures contract or swaps. A derivative is anything that basically it just derives its value from an underlying instrument, from a separate investment, a separate security. A really good way to visualize what a derivative is, think of an inner tube being pulled along by a boat on a lake. Ultimately, the long-term direction of that tube is going to be influenced by the direction of the boat. But if the boat turns right, there's going to be a big swing in where that inner tube goes before it then gets pulled along. So you're going to have much bigger movements in the derivatives, both positive and negative, compared to what it's actually following. So if you buy a call option on Apple and then Apple goes up, in theory, your call option should go up even more percentage-wise. If you buy a call option on Apple, but Apple goes down, your call option percentage-wise should go down in value more than what the share price did. So derivatives are simply instruments that derive their value from something else, some other financial instrument, and they usually have some sort of massive leverage associated with them, just like call or put options do on stocks. Now, the other feature that derivatives have is that they're contracts, and so there's always two parties associated with a derivative contract. So think of a call option. You can either sell or buy a call. Because if you have 100 shares of Apple and you want to get some income on it, you might sell a covered call against your shares of Apple. You get some income from that. If the price of Apple goes up, then your shares get called away from you at the strike price. You keep your income, and that contract requires you to sell your shares at the strike price of that call. Meanwhile, the other person on the other side of that trade who bought that call from you, they had to pay you for that contract, but they locked in that buy price, and the price of Apple went up, and so they exercised their right to buy those shares from you. So in every contract, in every derivative contract, there's going to be two sides to the contract. Okay, now let's put this together. Financial institutions have balance sheets that are loaded up with arbitrage plays using derivatives. Now, in reality, they are using derivatives that are extremely illiquid. They're over the counter. They're not publicly traded. They're not traded on exchanges. These can be created just for specific clients. For instance, the hedge fund, the Renaissance hedge fund, their medallion fund, it's the best performing hedge fund of all time. They were able to get Deutsche Bank to offer them specific contracts that are called basket options, which instead of these options being associated with single stocks, they're associated with baskets of stocks. And so these financial institutions are able to create these contracts. And so they're extremely illiquid. They're hard to value just because there's a lot of subjectivity in assigning these contracts value until they're exercised. And they trade over the counter, and so there's no central place to go and see how many of them there are and how much they're worth and where they're trading and who has them. And so putting all of this together, we have arbitrage plays using derivatives. So they don't do this with stock options, but if they did, this is what it would look like. I'm going to buy a call option on Apple. Now, I've got somebody else on the other side of that contract, right? Because I own the right to buy shares of Apple from them. For a different trade, I'm going to sell a call on Apple to somebody else. That means that if that person desires and that person exercises their right, they can buy shares of Apple from me. Now, I'm going to only do this if I can make sure that the price at which I would buy Apple and then sell Apple would be at a profit to me, number one. And number two, I would do it in a way that would cause the actual premium that I pay for that right to buy it from somebody else and the premium that I get from this person for them having the right to buy Apple shares from me is at a benefit to me, and I'm not losing money on that spread either. In case that didn't make sense, I'm buying a contract from somebody and I'm selling the same or a very, very, very similar contract to somebody else. And the difference I'm going to pocket, just like a drop shipper or a garage saler. I'm doing this with derivatives contracts. Now, that small difference between the two is what I'm going to be able to place on my balance sheet. That's my net position. That's my net exposure. Because theoretically, I don't have any risk here other than my total net position. Because if this person decides to collect Apple shares from me, I can go collect Apple shares from this person. I don't have any net risk here. Even though I don't have the Apple shares myself, I don't have any risk here other than the difference between the two contracts. Okay, so on my balance sheet with this options trade on Apple, I might have a net position of $100, but my gross position might be tens of thousands of dollars. Now, the difference between the net position and the gross position, the net position is the difference that I'm pocketing, right? But the gross position is the total amount of the position I'm short and the total amount of the position that I'm long. Now, normally in normal market conditions, the gross position doesn't really matter because there's virtually no risk. But in crazy markets, in broken markets, in financial crisis type markets, we have a little thing called counterparty risk. Now, counterparty risk is the risk that the person on the other side of the contract might not actually be able to deliver on their side of the bargain. It's the drop shipper who sells a product they don't have, and then they go to order that product from somebody else at a cheaper price, and that warehouse is all sold out and out of stock. And so the gross position, the amount that I'm short and the amount that I'm long added together, is tens of thousands of dollars versus my actual balance sheet position, which is, let's say, only $100. Okay, so now let's look at Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is a financial institution that has the ability to create credit out of thin air, and they assign their traders massive amounts of money to go out and do these trades. Deutsche Bank has a net balance sheet amount of their derivatives trading in the realm of $1 billion. Now, their total balance sheet is somewhere around $800 billion. So $1 billion being allocated to trading derivatives seems like it's literally nothing. Like it's not even worth looking at. But that's net. And what did we just learn about a net derivatives position? Oh yeah, that's right. The net position can be a tiny fraction of the total gross position. And in fact, with Deutsche Bank, surprise, surprise, it is. With a little bit of balance sheet digging, you can find that Deutsche Bank's gross exposure in the over-the-counter derivatives market is somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 trillion. And their net position is $1 billion. 40 trillion to $1 billion. Remember how big Deutsche Bank is in total? Their total balance sheet, 800 billion. Their gross derivatives exposure, 40 trillion. Okay, now we see the problem here. Number one, in crazy markets and in crisis markets, counterparty risk turns into a real thing. Number two, in markets where there are supply chain interruptions and payment chain interruptions, and all of the crazy things happening right now in our markets where oil futures are trading at negative prices and gold futures are not actually being delivered, and central banks are blowing up the rule books of traditional economics by printing money in forces that they've never printed before, negative real interest rates all over the world. Suffice it to say that the financial markets are experiencing a little bit of stress right now. This means that counterparty risk is real. Number two, remember what I said about how these things are actually valued? Well, they're extremely illiquid, they're over the counter, and sometimes they're created specifically for individual clients, which means that the valuation of these contracts is highly subjective. So what does that mean when your net position is $1 billion exposing you to $40 trillion worth of derivatives? It means that if there's any error in the way these things are valued, that $1 billion net position could overnight become a negative $1 trillion position or more. Now, yes, this does work both ways. And so if there's miscalculation or a default in a way that actually benefits Deutsche Bank, this could be a positive trillions of dollars error. But when you have a trading position, a gross position that gives you exposure to financial instruments that are extremely difficult to tell the value of, number one, and number two, there's an extremely high likelihood of counterparty default, especially in crisis times like now, and your exposure could cause losses that are bigger than your entire financial institution altogether by 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times? Yeah, it's a big deal. And the icing on the cake, Deutsche Bank is just the biggest example. Every financial institution, every large bank is engaged in the exact same type of balance sheet gearing, exposure to large derivative positions, and only accounting for net instead of gross exposure because that's all the accounting rules require. The likelihood that something has already begun to happen that is going to start a ripple effect that will infect its way through this opaque derivatives market is almost 100% considering the financial crisis and the global economic crisis that we're facing right now. You can't have a derivatives book that large without being exposed to things that are only profitable in normal times because quite honestly, most financial instruments don't make any allowance for something that has never happened before, black swan events. And if and likely when this starts to blow up, Yes, it does have the capacity to take out the entire financial system with it, which is one of the things we were scared about 12 years ago during the Lehman failure. Yet another reason to expect more and more intervention, nationalization, and monetary expansion from central banks all around the world. Hope you enjoyed it. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching, and you have a great day.